Good morning. I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about telecommunications reform, in particular reform of the use of the spectrum in Guatemala, a little bit about the use of the spectrum in El Salvador, and comparing it to how it's done in the United States. As is mentioned in the program, I'm here for 1 year at Universidad Francisco Marroquín, teaching economics and researching the telecom market in Guatemala and in El Salvador. I'm doing that because Guatemala and El Salvador provide a very good case study of how to reform, and there's also a few lessons to learn about how it could be done a little better. Next page. We have to start with the usual caveat. It's coming. There we go. As you might expect, the opinions I expressed here are not those of Francisco Marroquín University, nor are they the opinions of the United States government. That's an important caveat because I have a lot to say, including a few criticisms about how things are done in the United States. Let me take just a minute or two to talk about what spectrum is. I am not an engineer, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page a little bit. The electromagnetic spectrum is basically the name we give to types of radiation. What's radiation? It's energy that spreads out from a source. An example is the light from a lamp. Light from the sun is an example as well. Radio waves coming out from a transmitter for radio or television or for your cell phone. Okay? All of these are using energy, and it's transmitted through the spectrum. Next slide. It can be expressed in a number of ways, such as energy, wavelength, or frequency. For the telecom market, and in particular for the use of the spectrum for communications, we think of and talk mostly about frequency or bands. These are parts of the spectrum. We measure frequency in cycles per second. It's called hertz. Most people have heard of hertz. A kilohertz is 1,000 hertz. Megahertz is 1,000,000 hertz, or 1,000,000 cycles per second. There's also such a thing as gigahertz, which is 1,000,000,000 cycles per second. Your favorite radio station, if they say we're transmitting at 98.7 FM, they're actually at 98.7 megahertz, or 98.7 million cycles per second. That's the piece of the spectrum that signal is going along. For purposes of communication, the relevant part of the spectrum, that which we are concerned with, is everything from a low of about 3, more or less, kilohertz to 300 gigahertz. That's a lot of spectrum. And just to put this in context, here is a little bit of layout of different uses of the spectrum. Way up at the end of this chart, the top end of the chart, we have low frequency, low energy, long wavelengths. And this is where you see communication by airplanes, ship-to-shore communication, AM radio, TVs, just a little bit higher frequency. Then you move into microwaves. A little higher up still is infrared light. Then there's visible light. Then you move to further down or further up, higher frequency and higher energy. You would have X-rays and then eventually gamma rays. What the government's going to regulate and is concerned with in terms of communication is the top part of this chart here. And that's communication by radio and shortwave radio, TV, etc. Next slide. Well, how do we determine who gets what in this block of spectrum? It's allocated. Each country has jurisdiction over the spectrum in their geographical area. It's allocated by these frequency blocks or bands. Countries dictate, very, very commonly, countries will dictate the types of use that may be made in each band, such as broadcasting in this band or frequency and navigation in this band. And we call that allocation. Every country does this to some extent. Countries also determine who gets the rights to each band. In other words, after saying this particular band will be used for broadcasting and we'll carve it up into 4 or 10 or 100 pieces, then who gets each piece? That's called assignment. And how that is done in countries varies quite a bit. Next slide. Spectrum liberalization, which is really what we want to talk about today, is really what is interesting in Guatemala. Well, what is spectrum liberalization? That's increasing the bundle of rights to that little sliver of spectrum that you have. How it may be used, who you may sell it to or lease it to, and under what circumstances you may do this. Spectrum liberalization means increasing this bundle of rights and decreasing the restrictions on that use. At the extreme, or at a very liberalized model, you might think of it as anything that's peaceful. In other words, any use of the spectrum that doesn't interfere with someone else, someone immediately next door to you on the spectrum band, or somewhere else using the spectrum. If they have a right to use it and you have a right to use it, and you're not interfering with it, if we have a very flexible or liberalized regime, well, that would be the ideal in terms of anything that's peaceful. A very liberalized approach would be anything that's peaceful, we will allow it. Nobody does that, by the way. Okay. Why is this important? Why do we care about liberalization in the first place? Well, liberal rights to use the spectrum are necessary for efficient use of this critical resource. Rights, and I will talk about what rights in just a second, are important for efficient use. Well, what do we mean by efficient use? We mean the ability to create the most amount of value at the least cost. That's what we mean by efficiency in economic terms. That which is economically efficient creates the most value using the least amount of resources. This is not to be confused with technical efficiency, which often happens in a resource like spectrum. People who are very good at engineering, who understand technology very well, say, we got a way to use this spectrum. Okay, but if you're not creating value for someone, it's not economically efficient. Next slide. I want to talk about El Salvador and Guatemala in particular because they are two leading examples. And I'm mentioning them because Ronald Coase, the Nobel Prize winner, in 1959 wrote a paper entitled The Federal Communications Commission, where I worked back in Washington. And he was saying, you know what, the spectrum could be sold. Rights to use the spectrum could be sold to the highest bidder, the person or company that values it the most. And he wrote another paper in 1960, and the editors responded thusly. This is a remarkable document. Time somehow has left the authors behind. They ignore the social, cultural, and political values which have come to inhere in mass communications, in particular broadcasting, as well as 50 years of administrative law developments. I know of no country on the face of the globe, except for a few corrupt Latin American dictatorships, where the sale of spectrum could even be seriously considered. Okay, well, that was in 1960. Over 40 years later, the sale of the spectrum is not only considered, it is practiced, and it is the law in many countries in Europe, in the United States, and in many countries in Latin America. But 40 years ago, it was something to laugh at. Instead, what we have is today two Latin American countries, not dictatorships, thank you, that have done quite a bit and have taught an important lesson to the United States and Europe and other countries about how to reform spectrum. But while we're talking about silly comments, next slide, I just wanted to add one more. This was from an FCC commissioner in 1968. He's no longer there, so I'm going to quote him on this statement. I am far from convinced that 75 megahertz is necessary to provide common carrier service so each car owner may have another status symbol. It's high time that the Commission make every effort to investigate new modes of vehicular communications that either do not depend on spectrum or that do so in a conservative fashion. I'm not quite sure how you can communicate between cars or between planes or between boats and not use spectrum. It would require a very long cord and you couldn't go very far. But people say these things. So, the technology apparently scares people. It's hard for them to grasp. It's hard for them to see because they don't see it. So it's hard for them to see how assigning rights might be important. but it is. And what rights really matter? The lawyers and the law school professors are better at this than I am, but I'm going to throw in a little law and economics. And for my reading of law and economics, two rights that are extremely important are, one, transferability. That means the ability to sell it or lease it, the resource I have, to someone who values it more, usually for a fee. And flexibility, the ability to use the resource however I see fit, subject only to not interfering with other people's rights to use their resources to go about their lives. Both rights are important, and I want to stress this because the United States does a pretty good job in one and not such a good job in the other. If you have transferability, you can transfer your right to anyone you want, but this block of spectrum can only be used for broadcasting, and there's 3 different providers here, 3 different bands. And over here it can only be used for mobile telecommunications, and over here only for point-to-point communications between buildings. If you have the right to transfer, but somebody over here who's assigned to only provide point-to-point communications, these people can't compete with the broadcasters, can't compete with mobile telephony operators. They don't have flexibility to say, well, I've got spectrum, it would be useful for providing this service. So granting the right to transfer a resource while restricting what you can do with the resource doesn't even take you halfway. It's very limiting, okay? And similarly, if you had the right to use the resource however you wanted, but you couldn't sell it to anyone, someone comes along with a way to use it better than you, again, we have a limit on economic efficiency. Okay. What restrictions might we expect? Well, we said anything that's peaceful, but we still might have some restrictions. Technical rules come to mind, and frequently, even among those who are very big advocates of spectrum liberalization, will say we should have some limits on the use of spectrum, such as maybe having high power users in these frequency bands and low power users a little ways removed. Why? Your cell phone company could not operate on a frequency band immediately next to your favorite television station or radio station. This operates at very low power. They operate at very high power. The reason why this operates at very low power is because you're holding it right next to your head. And you would not want the amount of energy that's coming out, going to the tower, to be frying your brain. So, we have low power operators, we have high power operators. We may want some kind of separation, very generally, sort of like zoning and land use law, as in perhaps we don't want a residential development immediately adjacent to a nuclear power plant. Maybe. Might be a good idea to separate them a little bit. But there's a caveat with this, an important caveat, and that is it's easy to overregulate and say we need these kinds of houses here, these kinds of schools here, or in spectrum we need these kinds of uses here and these kinds of uses here. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is we may want some separation, but we need to be very careful. It's easy to get too excited about this and overregulate. In effect, most countries in the world have done exactly that. Well, let's talk a little bit about the U.S. experience. Yes. I'm going to run through it fairly quickly because it's not terribly interesting, but you need to know just what's going on. I can do this in about 3 or 4 slides. In 1999, they issued a policy statement. Well, the year is interesting. The year is important, 1999 and 2002, because in a minute I'm going to talk about Guatemala, and they are earlier. Okay. 1999, a spectrum policy statement saying we need to develop secondary markets. Secondary markets is code for transferability, the ability to sell or lease the asset easily. 2002, a Spectrum Policy Task Force report came out. It recommended flexible use. Well, this is good. Now we're getting the other half, flexibility. But this is this also a report. It's a policy statement. It's a report. It's not law. Okay, it's just recommendations. Okay, next page. We did a few other things that were pretty good. In 1994 and in 1996, we established two different sets of rules, one for broadband PCS. If you've heard of Sprint PCS, that's one of the providers in the United States. They operate on this. Wireless Communication Service operates on what's called Part 27. Well, who cares about Part 24 and Part 27? They're important because they allow a couple of different kinds of uses. Notice Part 27 allows fixed, mobile, radio location, which is finding things using the spectrum, where they located when they send a signal. A lot of different services. That is very good. That is getting at the flexibility that is important. Now, also the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which didn't do much for spectrum. The reason why I mentioned Part 24 and Part 27 is because it's very good, it's very flexible. We just don't have very much spectrum in the United States that is subject to Part 24 or Part 27. It's only applied to a few special cases, a few industries. Next slide. There's also this thing called the Secondary Markets Report and Order, 2003 and 2004. Now this is law. This is policy. It allows transferability. So we're making real progress on allowing people to sell their spectrum usage rights. Okay, it's not a property right, but their spectrum usage rights in the United States. Easier to buy and sell. That's good. And in 2004, we made it easier still, allowed it trading to happen with more and more licenses. Next page. So a quick evaluation of the U.S. experience, I would say on transferability, on our two things, transferability and flexibility, that are so important. Transferability, the U.S. is doing good, moving to very good. Okay? Allowed in 2004, when leasing became possible, over 115 leasing applications filed. How about flexibility? That, I would say, is fair to poor, not very good. Part 24 and Part 27 apply only to a few industries, a few uses of the spectrum. So we've got a long ways to go on that. Well, let's talk about Guatemala then. This is what's interesting. I would imagine most of you know there's this little thing called the Ley General de Telecomunicaciones in 1996. Model legislation in my mind. It allocated spectrum, a quick review of the law, allocated spectrum in three categories. One, government use. Policía Nacional, this sort of thing. Your military, various other government uses. Government needs a lot of spectrum. So it says, and there's a little bit of truth to that. Number two, reserved for amateurs. People who they broadcast and talk to each other, ham radio and other types of amateur uses. This isn't, and they do experiments, scientific experiments. The third group is what's really interesting. It's called, I'm translating from the Spanish here, the regulated band. I call it, in parentheses here, the liberalized band, because it is the least, one of, if not the least regulated bands, pieces of spectrum, in the world. But for some reason Guatemala decided to call it the regulated bands. I think that was to separate it from government and amateurs. We have these other bands and we're going to keep an eye on them. We're going to call them regulated, but we're going to regulate them very little. Okay, that's fine. Here's what, let's just quickly review the government and the amateur use. 1,335 megahertz. That's quite a bit because it's 1,000 of those 1,335 megahertz lie between 3 megahertz and 3,000 megahertz. 3,000 megahertz, if you're following me on the math here, is the same thing as 3 gigahertz, okay? Add 3 more zeros. Why is this important? This is prime spectrum. This is beachfront property. This is the stuff people want and pay a lot of money for at auction. Government has a third of that in Guatemala. Okay. It has more in other countries, so. How about amateur use? 4,761 megahertz. Wow, that's a lot. But only 12 of those megahertz lie in that really prime beachfront property. So they got a lot of desert land somewhere else way up the spectrum to use to run their experiments on and to communicate. So that's fine. These parties receive an autorización de uso de frecuencia. These cannot be sold or transferred. If you're the government Policía Nacional, or any agency, you can't sell off part of your spectrum to a private company. So this is government and amateur use, and it's a little bit less interesting than these regulated bands. Let's talk about them. Next slide. The regulated or liberalized bands, there we go. These parties receive a TUF, Título de Usufructo. I guess that makes the other one an OOF, but I don't know if that's right or not. We do say TUF in English. Amongst English speakers, it's a TUF, and we never even refer to those government bands. So, Título de Usufructo. A título de usufructo can be traded and has flexibility under technical constraints. By the way, my best translation of título de usufructo is a usufructuary right. I think that's pretty close. It is, I'll talk in a minute about just how close that is to a property right. TUFs in Guatemala describe four things, and four things only: schedule of operation, area of operation, maximum transmission power, and maximum interference at the border of the coverage area. And I hope I have a pretty picture for you here on the next slide. This is what one looks like. The Superintendencia de Telecomunicaciones was kind enough to supply me with this. What you see here is, okay, they also say, here's your band. You've got this frequency range, roughly 860 to 860.8. Or actually, it's smaller than that. But let's just say you have 860 to 861, 1 megahertz. That's what you've got. If you look at the bottom, área geográfica, you've got it for the whole country. If this is your TUF, you've got it for the whole country. Time of operation, all the time. It's yours all the time. Maximum power, this is basically how much you can send out within your area. And the other one is how much power at the border. So if this is my band, I can have a certain amount of power in it. And then when I go over into my neighbor's band here, I need to have less power. It's going to dribble over. It's just like having a fire in your backyard, having some smoke going over into your neighbor's property. Some power, some radiation is going to go into your neighbor's band. But it has to be a certain amount and no more. And that's what this is saying. These are very good, clear, simple rules. Okay, next slide. TUFs are not licenses. We have licenses in the United States. We have licenses in most every country on the planet. Here we have TUFs. A TUF is a right to a license is a right to a particular use. You may do this here in this way, etc. Occasionally, such as the Part 24 and Part 27 licenses I mentioned, you can do a couple of different things. That's considered radical in the United States, and it's good. You have choice of doing a couple of different things. A TUF is not that at all. It is about as close as you can get to a property right. It is the freedom to use the spectrum as you see fit, subject to technical restrictions. Next slide. I'm not going to take up too much time on this one. Allocating TUFs. Basically, following the 1996 telecom law, the government said, "Look, we're going to give out TUFs, and what we'll do is you can ask for one, and we won't let you have it if someone else already does have it." Makes sense. Or if it's against international treaties. Sometimes some spectrum is blocked off by international law. But if you ask for it, we'll also make a public announcement saying, this person has asked for the spectrum. And if anyone else comes forward and says, I'd like it too, that very same spectrum, I'd like it too, then you have an auction. And the spectrum goes to the highest winner. This is a very logical process. Thanks. And here's what's happened in Guatemala. The first little block, starting kind of low, is 1996, right after the telecom law. Goes up to a peak, 96, 97, 98, and 99, up to almost 1,600 TUFs auctioned. Obviously, more than one person wanted a lot of different spectrum. This is how much spectrum was auctioned, how many TUFs were auctioned, excuse me. And it's decreased since because the prime spectrum is getting out to being used by people. There's also a number of TUFs being traded, and this, in addition, is very good news. That means some people are getting the spectrum, using it. Someone else comes along who can use it better, and they're buying it from the original owner. Next slide. here's a little bit of the results. Many of you probably seen this. Most of you have cell phones. The fast sloping line, the red line, is mobile telephony. The other line is fixed telephony. Unfortunately, my data is 1 year old, but a year ago, at the end of 2003, there were less than 1 million fixed lines in Guatemala. Not too good, but you know, a lot of countries are doing worse. What's so impressive is mobile telephony. It's rising and has been rising since the telecommunications reform. A lot of competition in this market. Next slide. A lot of competition, meaning you're going to have a lot of people subscribing. Now, 4 providers are, as we all know, moving to 3, and that Bell South and Telefonica had this little marriage going on. I'm not going to comment on antitrust or merger, especially since Todd Zwicky has mentioned this, and really I will say nothing more than it's interesting to see this pie chart and realize that the 2 companies out of the 4 that are merging are the 2 smaller companies, and the combined company, again with data that's 1 year old, will still have a market share that's smaller than the other 2. Okay, so you're getting, instead of 4 providers, you're getting 3, but 3 a little bit more evenly sized. I'm not commenting on good or bad, I'm just pointing that out. And that's the telecom market as we see it in Guatemala. Let's look at some telephone rates. I was going to say Guatemala has the lowest mobile rates in Latin America. I can't quite prove that, so I'll say it's one of the lowest in Latin America. 2 cents US per minute, about 10 cents per minute, to 7.5 to 10 cents a minute to call the US. I call home for 10 cents a minute. All my family and friends who call me scream at me the next month when they get their phone bills for what it costs them to call me. So it's very impressive, the prices that you're paying for mobile telephony here in Guatemala. Next slide. Very quickly about broadcast. Broadcasters, always a special case here in Guatemala and every country in the world. But the broadcasters receive their TUFs without auction, just so you'll know. Additional parties could come in and ask for unused TUFs within the broadcast spectrum, the spectrum that had been set aside, because spectrum was set aside just for broadcasting. It's so high power. And the spacing between stations was very small. As a result, you have a lot of broadcasting in Guatemala. You have, well, you can see the data here for television. I'll just jump to radio. Up to 50 TUF holders. That does not mean 50 stations in the FM band, but in the FM band, 50 different people with licenses, or parties with not licenses, TUFs, who could compete. And some of them are just sitting on their TUF right now, not using it. Next slide. And here is a little bit hard to read because there's so many of them. This is just the FM market for Guatemala, Zacatepeques. 50 TUF holders. 50 TUF holders. Guatemala City. So, very, very, very high penetration. Very, very competitive broadcast market. Next slide. Let me talk very briefly about El Salvador. They had a law, Ley de Telecomunicaciones, 1 year after Guatemala. It also broke up the spectrum, or distinguished, the use of spectrum into 3 categories, a little bit different from Guatemala. Government use, again, autorización is what they called that. Broadcasters. Instead of amateurs in slot 2, we had broadcasters. But if you remember, as I just described, broadcasters in Guatemala got special treatment too. Finally, they have regulated, which again, I don't like, I call it liberal use category, and they call these concesiones. Okay? So they're not TUFs in El Salvador, they're concesiones. But they're pretty good in terms of our standards, flexibility, transferability. Like Guatemala, as I just mentioned, broadcasters got special treatment. Like Guatemala and like most every other country on the planet. Like Guatemala, they have allocations that are not TUS, but are concessions, as I mentioned. But these concessions, again, not but, these concessions, like Guatemala, are subject pretty much just to technical limits and to international law. A little bit more restrictive, but not much. Here's the dense slide that tells you why they're a little bit more restrictive. If you remember, in Guatemala, there were only 4 things that they were concerned about. Within this spectrum band, here's what we need to know: the area, the time of operation, the power going into your neighbor's band. Well, here in El Salvador, they want a few more details. They want the operation hour. I'll skip down a few. Modulation type, gain, and pattern of radiation. Okay, but interesting. Information on the transmitting tower, information on the receiving towers, height of tower, height above land, height above sea level of the tower that's going to be doing the transmitting. A little bit more detail. There's no test on the material in this slide. It's just to kind of show you why I'm arguing that they've added a few extra rules, and I'm not sure if they're quite necessary, technical rules, in El Salvador. But here they are. Okay, next slide. Well, what are the outstanding issues? I've been bragging about Guatemala here and back in the United States. It goes over well sometimes, sometimes not. And I always point out Guatemala is a case study in so many things that are right about how they approach spectrum. But it's not perfect. It seldom is. When you're transitioning to a more liberalized world, it's seldom perfect. 2 examples of problems in Guatemala. One is pirate radio, and the other is political discretion. Pirate radio is unauthorized use of the spectrum, and we frequently call it pirate radio when it is existing in broadcast. Happens a lot more in radio. Why? It's easy to get. For a few $1,000s, you can become a radio broadcaster and climb up to the top of a hill and give your commentary to whoever wants to listen to you. At one time, Guatemala had 400 pirate radio stations operating. A bit of a problem. If you notice, and I'm sure all of you know this better than I do, your radio stations here actually have public service announcements saying the use of this band is only for authorized blah, 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 people who hold a TUF, and any unauthorized use, blah, blah, blah. What they're saying is, this band belongs to somebody, or all bands belong to somebody. If you're going to advertise on a radio station, make sure it's to somebody who has a right to operate at that frequency. And by the way, if you're operating and you don't have a right to operate at that frequency, we may punish you. The problem is Guatemala has not done a very good job of punishing people who do this. Some authorized users, some broadcasters even say that there has been pressure on the seat by politicians, either in the executive branch or the Congress, to not enforce. Why would this be? Well, because the pirate radio people are popular. Sometimes they have a large audience. Sometimes they're religious broadcasters. Sometimes they're others. And people listen to them. And it's not, if you're a politician, you don't quite want those people to be getting angry. So you might pressure the regulator to not enforce property rights. This is not a good thing. Why? Because people who have the property right feel less secure with that right. Okay, next slide. There's also this little problem of political discretion. I'm going to describe it, a better case of political discretion, as in a better example in El Salvador. But first, here in Guatemala, political discretion. What is it? It's basically when rights are not well protected because politicians or anyone in government can change the rules of the game on you, and then as a result, you're going to have less incentive to invest. As a rule, Guatemala has had very little problem with this. And I want to stress, when I say pirate radio, it's a problem in Guatemala. Yes, it is. But I'm talking about looking carefully at the Guatemalan market in telecom, in the use of the spectrum. And this is the big problem. And you know what? Pirate radio and political discretion are problems in every country. And political discretion is a problem that's much worse in most every other country. So, when we're criticizing Guatemala, we need to make the criticism and then recognize, yes, it's bad, it's worse in many other countries. Page down. Let's see. Here's an example of political discretion. I think a few of you might be familiar with this. A little company by the name of Comcel had a right to use spectrum before the telecom reform of 1996. And most of you probably have been listening to this story a lot longer than I have, but Comcel was paying a percentage of its profits to use spectrum and provide mobile telephony service again. And then after the reform, other companies came in and bought TUS. And they started to compete. So Comcel said to a few people, listen, this isn't fair. We're paying 10% of our profits. These jokers, they're not paying anything. Well, they, of course, paid for spectrum at auction. And we don't have TUS. We don't have this large bundle of rights that these people do. We can only provide mobile telephony. Okay. Well, and they finally found somebody favorable to listen to them in the Portillo administration after a few checks were sent to Miami, and they started changing the rules. So this is a better example of a political bribe than political discretion. The point here is, had the transition been done well, better, and the transition was done pretty well. Had it been done better, everybody would have had the same rights from 1996 on, and Comcel wouldn't have any case to make. It's very hard to do that exactly right. I would probably expect a question challenging me to tell me exactly how to do it. But clearly it was done in a way that left the market open for some political discretion, and Mr. Portillo obliged. Okay, let's talk about El Salvador. Pirate radio is not a problem in El Salvador. It's not a problem. Why? Largely, their pirate radio operators in the 80s and up to 1990 or so, they were Marxist guerrillas. Had their equipment, and they would go to the hilltop and broadcast, and then move quickly before they were shot. And this is how they operated. Well, those people in 1990 and 91 with the peace accords in El Salvador, they were given, a number of the guerrillas were given broadcast, not concesiones, but licenses. Then, right before the reform in 96, 97 of the telecom law in El Salvador, you saw another increase in pirate radio, this time more religious radio and the like. And again, the government stepped in and said, okay, one last time, here you go. For a few of you, kind of the big operators in pirate radio, you're going to get rights to the spectrum. What did they do? I asked one of the Salvadoran broadcasters about this, the head of their broadcast union, and they told me, listen, the difference between Guatemala and El Salvador is, in El Salvador, we seized the moment. And Guatemala missed a chance in 96. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it's an interesting story. And it's certainly, seizing the moment to them was to pay off people who are using the spectrum illegally. But it has solved their pirate radio problem today. Okay? Political discretion. Here it's worse than Guatemala. Why? Essentially, they had a little problem approximately around 2000, a few years after they reformed, where the president of the country, president of El Salvador, wanted some spectrum in the broadcasting bands to be given to political friends. And the regulator, the head of the regulatory agency, didn't think that was a very good idea, seeing as how you had concesiones and people should have to acquire the rights competitively. It was quite unheard of to not listen to your president, who's your boss, by the way. This gentleman was fired. The head of the agency was fired, essentially for not responding to the president who said, get the spectrum out to these people over here. That is a good example of political discretion. Okay? Governments dictating who's winning and who's losing, and that's going to change the nature of the game, nature of competition in that market. Let's take a look at just a couple of lessons. What we want to take away from this, our wrap-up. One, increasing rights to use the spectrum increases the use of that spectrum and increases efficiency, and I mean economic efficiency, creating more value with using less resources. This translates to consumer benefits. However, it's necessary to protect the rights. Usually we think of this as a role for government. Okay? Somebody, at the least, needs to protect your rights when they are being interfered with by somebody else. So protect you against other users, and also protection against political mischief. By that I mean you want to limit political discretion. It's not possible to do it entirely. You want to do it as much as you can. Finally, last slide, the overlooked lesson. This is a lesson that's so hard for people to learn, for regulators especially to learn, my brethren in the United States and in Europe. What is it? The traditional approach is, as I said at the very beginning, regulators determine what kind of services are going to be in this band and who's going to provide them, which is appropriate. And the licensee can only offer what's allowed. And Guatemala essentially turned this approach on its head. It said, we're going to just make some very technical, very simple technical rules. High power here, everybody else over here. We're going to be consistent with a few international treaties and laws, and a few other technical rules, and after that, you can do whatever you want. This is much more consistent with what it means to have a property right. It's much more consistent with the efficient use of resources, and it's therefore much more consistent with what's going to benefit consumers in the long run. Thanks very much. I'll take any questions.
Good morning. I just have a question regarding media access. As you know, media access and media control is a very important aspect of democracy. And it runs on Hertzian waves. So how do you respect the principle of transferability and avoid the formation of monopolies at the same time? Look at the television, for an example. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I didn't have time to get to it in the presentation, so I'm very glad you asked it. You're absolutely right that it's possible for parties to acquire, maybe one broadcaster to acquire all of a resource, and then we know what monopolies do. They raise prices and provide poor quality service. Well, one way we can deal with this is by regulating strictly. We could determine there will always be at least 10 broadcasters, 10 different bands allocated to broadcasting, and nobody can have 2 of those. Well, that means you're always going to have 10 providers. That would be one way to approach it. Another way to approach it is to say nobody can acquire more than a certain amount. We'll just leave it to the antitrust authorities, as Todd Zwicky was talking about earlier, to determine somebody just acquired some of that spectrum. Is this anti-competitive? Interestingly, Guatemala's 1996 law says nothing about antitrust. El Salvador's does. Guatemala's does not. And here's how people in the seat have described the reasoning for that. If you take a large enough amount of spectrum and you give flexibility and transferability to it, so you say all of this spectrum here can be used for broadcasting. Right now, this much is being used for broadcasting. Any of this can be. This is used for some other high-power approach. And we're going to auction it off in many, 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 many different slivers, like you saw with FM radio, 50. Now, somebody who wishes to be a monopolist really has a challenge. Try buying up 49 people who don't like you and compete with you. Very hard to do. As a matter of fact, after you've got about 10 of them or 20 of them and you're starting to get in a position where maybe you could get some monopoly profits, other people are saying, yeah, we're going to come in and we're going to do everything you do and compete against you. So flexibility and transferability, getting a lot of the resource out there and having it such that anybody can provide this service, not just people who are designated as broadcasters by the government, is one of the best ways to avoid monopolistic practices.